Hey class, this is a documentary on Phyllis Wheatley. It's by me and Joe, and Phyllis Wheatley is one of our most beloved poets. Some of the things that are really cool about her are just like the fact that she was the first African American at all published in colonial America, and not only that, she was pretty much the first African woman to be published in America, and she did this while she was a slave. She was a slave working in Boston for a good chunk of her life. Anyway, let's move on. She was born here in Africa. Although people are not completely sure about where she was born, it is widely believed that she was born here in West Africa, in the modern day country of Senegal, which is by Guinea and Mali, which was where most of the slaves brought to the colonial America came from. And her name is actually very interesting. It comes from the slave ship that brought her. The ship was named the Phillis, and that's how she got her first name. This is an example of a drawing of a slave ship, and you could see how awful these things were. I mean, majority of the slaves didn't even make it to America. They had to get thrown overboard because they died of disease and starvation, even though the captain of the ship tried to do everything that he could to prevent the slaves from dying. And the other part of her name, her last name, comes from her master. It was customary in the time for slaves to take the surname of their master, and she took the surname of her master, John Wheatley. John Wheatley was basically a merchant trading things like gold and silver in colonial Boston, and this is a map of colonial Boston. And basically he was a very liberal man for that era. I mean, it's incredible, but that he did the ways he treated Phyllis. For example, at that time it was almost unheard of for any slave to learn. I mean, he and his wife Mary personally funded an education for Phyllis. They taught her they taught her how to read, not just very basic stuff, but complex stuff. She learned Greek and Latin when she was a slave because her master wanted her to learn so badly. I just can't believe that they did that back then. And not only that, they almost treated her more so like a daughter than a slave. Once they found out that she had a very a great poetic talent, they decided that it was really not worth having her do the chores around the house anymore, and they basically had the other slaves do that, and basically they treat her as their own daughter. And that is really interesting, considering how cheap he got her for. I mean, she was sold to John Wheatley for almost next to nothing, and that is because the captain of the ship, the Phyllis, thought that she had become fatally ill on the trip, and he basically thought that he should get something for dragging her to America, even though it was against her will. And she started writing poetry at a very young age. She got published as a teenager, for God's sakes. That's almost unheard of even today. And some of her famous, really famous poems include Ode to Neptune, His Excellency General Washington, and that was actually dedicated specifically for George Washington, and he even went to Boston to personally thank Phillis for writing him this amazing poem. They also include Gulf of Golf, a hymn to humanity, and on being brought from Africa to America. Now that is a very interesting poem. And the reason why is because here's how it goes. Anyway, it says, "'Twas mercy taught me from my pagan land, taught my brightened soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some views our stable race with scornful eye. The color is a debacle dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." Alright, so there are several interpretations on what this poem means. One of the more common ones, even though this sounds strange, it basically says that she's almost happy that she was kidnapped from her homeland in Africa and dragged to America as a child. And the reason why she says that is because she feels like she would have never had the opportunity to convert to Christianity had it not been for her kidnapping. And and that's extremely odd, I know, but that's one of the major themes. And this is really one of the only few poems that she actually talked about slavery at all. I mean, it's bizarre considering how she was, but it's not but people could understand why she did that. And the reason why is she was pretty much a slave when she wrote a majority of her poems. She was freed in the late 1770s when her master died, and basically her last poem written was in 1776 that we have a good record on, and it was the Excellency to George Washington poem. And so basically she was a slave while she wrote all of her great poems. And considering the way that her masters treated her, she had a great life as a slave. I mean, she didn't have to work in fields. She was treated like a child. She was given an education. She converted to Christianity, although most slaves did at the time. And so one could determine that it's extremely likely that the reason why she didn't complain really was because of the fact that she had a very good life as a slave, and she didn't have to, and she was probably afraid that if she said these people are awful, that her masters would probably kick her out and starve her. Either that, or they would actually start treating her like a slave. And there are several themes that coincide with this, with not just this poem but all of her works. And those themes include Christianity, which basically became her religion of choice, and classicism, in which she writes, she writes modern ideas, but in olden form. If you wanted to, an example would be if you wanted to write a poem about the United States and talk like William Shakespeare or something like that. And third one, which is like the weirdest one, includes hieroglyphic solar worship, and this came from her. Was one of the things that she brought with her from her African home. She believed consistent. African nations at that time basically worshipped the sun and thought that if you didn't have these rituals to the sun gods, that they would eventually kill you and take revenge on you. So that was one of the themes that we consistently see through her poems, the fact that she still had some cult of her African heritage in her, and she didn't completely Americanize during her time in the country. And now I'd like to talk about the later life of Phillis Wheatley. Well, I said earlier that pretty much her last poem was written in 1776, and the reason why was because most of her poems were getting published in Great Britain, the United States. Even people in Boston, like John Hancock, didn't really like her, and they didn't even think that she wrote the poems herself. They even basically brought her to trial and said, admit it, your masters wrote this, you didn't. And she wouldn't do that. And so most of her poems were written in Great Britain, and during the Revolutionary War, basically authors became non-existent. There were almost no poetic authors in America at that time. You still got newspapers, but stuff that Phillis Wheatley was writing didn't get to the colonists. They were focused more so on winning their independence. So basically her career was ruined by the Revolutionary War. And that also ruined her wealth. She did gain her freedom later in life after her master died, and the year that her master died, which was 1773. Oh, I'm sorry, that was my mistake. It was 1778. You could cross it out. Her master died in 1778, and that year she got married to a guy named John Peters, and basically he was a bum. He couldn't provide for her or their children, and he even got thrown into debtor's prison in 1784, which was basically, you're going to jail because you can't pay off the money you owe your town, the government, and all those businesses that you borrowed it from. And you're going to stay there until your family could pay it off for you. So basically she was forced to take care of her own children, and she died in 1784 on December the 5th at only the age of 31. And one of the really sad things about her infant son died about 3 hours or so after she did. So her life was pretty tragic, considering the slavery and the kidnapping and her terrible husband and her death. It was awful, but she still did a lot of great things. I mean, she still did plenty of great things. You know that. She was the first African American woman to get published in America. And that's about it. Thank you very much.